What if the truth about Princess Diana's final days was never lost, but deliberately buried inside the very palace walls? And what if the man who uncovered it wasn't a historian, but her own son, Prince William? That chilling thought is where this story begins, not with public headlines or polished royal statements, but with whispers echoing through hidden corridors of power. For years, William believed he had been told all there was to know about his mother's tragic death. The narrative was repeated so many times, it seemed unshakable. But the moment he stumbled upon a reference to a sealed file marked with his mother's name, everything he thought he knew began to unravel. The file was not something William was meant to see. It had been tucked away, shielded by the iron curtain of palace secrecy, its existence known only to a handful of trusted courtiers. Rumors surrounded talk of forbidden documents Charles had quietly ordered locked away. These were not just ordinary papers, but records tied to Diana's final hours. Documents the palace believed could never be released without igniting a firestorm. William was not supposed to know, and yet fate placed a clue in his path during what should have been a routine private briefing. A reference slipped through, a name, a date, an allusion to something that had no business being spoken in front of Diana's eldest son. The discovery gnawed at him. Why would there be a sealed file about his mother? Why had no one ever told him of its existence? He pressed for details, only to be met with vague denials, the kind of polished evasions he had grown used to hearing throughout his life. But beneath those denials, he recognized fear. That was when William began to suspect that his father had known more than he ever admitted. What was Charles hiding, and why? Whispers from within the palace walls grew louder. Confidants and aides spoke cautiously, hinting that Diana had not spent her last days in silence. She had begged for help. She had written words that were never meant to disappear. Yet, the official account had erased these details, reducing her story to tragedy without context. William could not shake the feeling that his father had played a direct role in that erasure, choosing loyalty to the monarchy over loyalty to the woman who had once been his wife and the mother of his sons. The emotional weight was suffocating. Betrayal simmered beneath the surface. William had been a boy when his mother was taken from him. A child forced to walk behind her coffin before the eyes of the world. He had believed for years that the palace had given him the truth. Now he realized the truth had been filtered, sanitized, reshaped into something easier to accept, but far removed from reality. It was not just his grief that had been managed, it was his entire understanding of what happened in Diana's final days. The file represented more than just locked documents. It symbolized a fracture between father and son, a hidden barrier William had never known existed. If Charles could conceal this, what else had been hidden all along? What other truths had been sacrificed to maintain the crown's carefully constructed facade? With every passing thought, William's trust in his father weakened. And as the question swirled, so too did the rage of a son who realized that even in death, his mother's voice had been silenced. But this was only the beginning, for what William would uncover next would not just haunt him, but force him to question his father's very soul. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace, Charles carried a burden so dark it could shatter the monarchy if spoken aloud. Why had he chosen silence over truth? That question cuts to the heart of a pact, forged not out of love, but out of fear. An agreement struck between Charles and the courtiers who served him, binding them together in secrecy that would outlast the woman they had all failed. In the final weeks of Diana's life, Charles knew more than he ever admitted. He had heard her voice tremble with suspicion, felt her fury in private conversations, and read the unease in her final words to friends. Yet, rather than allow those fears to reach the light of day, he sealed them away, turning his back on the raw truth she left behind. It was not ignorance that kept him silent, but calculation. A pact of shadows formed between him and those most loyal to the institution. They convinced themselves that to protect the crown, the truth must remain hidden. If Diana's last confessions were spoken, if her warnings were acknowledged, the monarchy itself could be torn apart by the weight of her words. And Charles agreed. He knew that what Diana feared in her final days went beyond gossip. It was the stuff of scandal, betrayal, and conspiracy that could leave the royal house permanently scarred. Instead of exposing it, he buried it under lock and key, instructing that these records never see the light of day. But no pact could erase the guilt that lived inside him. In the stillness of night, Charles replayed their last conversations in his mind. Diana's pointed remarks, her suspicions that she was being silenced, her pleas to be heard. He knew she was more fragile in those days than the world realized, and yet, instead of protecting her, he let the machinery of the crown decide her fate. This contradiction became his torment. To the outside world, he was the heir preserving dignity, stability, and order. But within himself, he was the man who had once sworn to honor her, now reduced to a husband hiding behind silence, terrified of what would happen if the truth was ever spoken. For the courtiers, the fear was simpler. Diana's final words could dismantle the royal narrative entirely. They knew that if the public learned what she had truly felt in her last days, that she was isolated, abandoned, and betrayed by those closest to her, the image of a strong, unshakable monarchy would crumble. To prevent this, they built a wall of secrecy. Documents were sealed, testimonies were edited, memories were reshaped. The official story was made clean, leaving no trace of the shadows behind it. But William noticed. He may not have understood it at first, but over the years he picked up on inconsistencies in his father's recollections. One moment, Charles would recall events with sharp precision. The next, he would falter, glossing over details or changing timelines. For William, it was not the silence that hurt most, but the subtle cracks in his father's mask. They betrayed a man holding back truths too heavy to carry, and with every inconsistency, suspicion took root. To William, this was no longer the story of a tragic accident. It was the story of betrayal layered in secrecy. His father had not just failed to save his mother. He had chosen to hide her final truth, binding himself to a silence that stretched across decades. The son was left wondering, what kind of man protects the crown at the cost of the woman who gave life to his children? And then came the whispers of a letter, Diana's last note, hidden away by Charles himself. Imagine holding a letter from your mother, written in her final days, but hidden from you for decades. This was William's reality. For years, he believed that every detail of his mother's tragic end had been placed before him, painful but complete. Yet now, in his hands, was something he had never been meant to see. A note written in Diana's own handwriting. A cry from the grave that shook him to the core. It was not a gentle farewell, nor a letter of reassurance. It was a warning. Diana had sensed danger circling her, and she put it into words that carried the weight of prophecy. The revelation came not by chance, but by confrontation. William, driven by gnawing suspicion, demanded answers from one of the few aides old enough to have lived through those turbulent days. The man hesitated, torn between loyalty to the crown and the quiet torment of knowing a secret too heavy to bear. With trembling words, he hinted that Charles had once held a letter Diana wrote in her final days, a letter that had never been shared with her sons. The mere suggestion set William's heart racing. His mother had spoken, and her words had been silenced. The betrayal cut deep, for this was not simply the erasure of a document, it was the erasure of her voice. When William finally read the letter, its tone was haunting, almost chilling in its clarity. Diana foresaw betrayal, and she feared that her end would not come by accident, but by design. The words were heavy with isolation, as though she knew her truth would one day be hidden away. She wrote of feeling abandoned, silenced, surrounded by shadows she could no longer trust. For William, every line of that note was like hearing her whisper from beyond the grave, warning him that her life had been taken from her in more ways than one. The emotional punch was devastating. This was not just the grief of a son missing his mother. It was the agony of realizing she had died without her truth being honored. To William, it meant that her legacy had been reshaped, her fears erased, her last voice deliberately muted by the very man who should have protected it. He could almost hear her pleading to be heard, and now he understood why that plea had been ignored. The crown had not only taken her life from the public stage, but stolen her right to speak in her final moments. The letter revealed fears so raw that they left William in silence. Diana feared not only betrayal but permanent abandonment. She felt surrounded by walls closing in, by powers larger than herself, and she knew she was running out of time. Those words were a confession of her deepest despair, a final attempt to warn her sons of the dangers that lived in the shadows of their own family. And yet those words had been locked away, not shared, not honored, but hidden, kept secret, by a father who had chosen silence over truth. William was crushed, his heart split between grief and fury. The father he trusted had not simply failed him. He had concealed the most precious part of his mother's legacy. To hide such a letter was to erase her, to reduce her final days to silence. And that, more than anything, left William broken. He had grown up longing for answers, yearning for closure, only to discover that the man closest to him had kept her final words buried all along. But William's anguish only deepened when he uncovered what Charles did during those haunting final hours. The night Diana drew her last breath. What really happened in the palace? The answers William unearthed paint a chilling picture. While the world slept in ignorance and the media scrambled to make sense of the unfolding disaster, the truth was already being whispered behind the thick walls of Buckingham Palace. Charles had been briefed before the nation even learned of the accident. He knew of Diana's critical condition, knew that her life hung in a fragile balance, and yet, in the moment when a husband and father should have acted out of instinct, he hesitated. Frozen, not by love, but by fear. Fear of scandal, fear of headlines, fear of what standing by her bedside might symbolize for a monarchy desperate to control the narrative. For William, learning this was unbearable. His father had not rushed to her side in Paris. Instead, Charles lingered, weighing options, considering implications. Minutes slipped into hours, while Diana fought for her life. This hesitation was not the indecision of a grieving man, but the paralysis of a figure torn between duty to the crown and compassion for the woman he had once vowed to honor. The palace became a theater of silence, where decisions were delayed and calls went unanswered. Eyewitness accounts later surfaced, whispering of moments when Charles was notified, urged even to act. Yet he chose caution over urgency. Those precious moments that might have been the difference between presence and absence were lost forever. What devastated William most was discovering that Diana, in her final hours, had asked for her boys. She had wanted to see William and Harry, to hold them one last time, to reassure them before the inevitable. But she never got the chance. The request was recorded, but never fulfilled. William realized the cruel weight of those words. His mother had left this world longing for her children, and he had been robbed of the chance to say goodbye. That truth shattered him. The image of Diana, fragile and fading, calling for the very sons she adored, only to be denied, was almost too much to bear. The weight of "what if" pressed down on William like a crushing storm. What if Charles had acted faster? What if he had allowed William and Harry to be flown to her side? What if Diana's last wish had been honored instead of buried beneath protocol and secrecy? Each unanswered question became a knife, twisting deeper into the wound of betrayal. He had believed his father was a man who at least tried to do what was right in the darkest of times. But the truth he uncovered painted a very different picture. A father paralyzed by fear and self-preservation, not driven by compassion or love. This revelation is what broke William completely. It wasn't just the realization that his mother had died. It was the crushing truth that his father had failed her when she needed him most. The father he thought he knew, the man he wanted to believe in, had not only hidden the truth, but had also stood still as his mother slipped away. The betrayal was complete. Trust fractured. Respect shattered. Grief became something darker, something sharper. For William, the man who should have protected Diana had become the very figure who abandoned her in the moment that mattered most. But the storm inside William only grew stronger when he realized he wasn't the only one Charles deceived. When Harry learned the same truth, his fury erupted, but William? He collapsed under the weight of it all. The revelation that their mother had pleaded for her sons in her final hours, that she had left behind a note foreseeing danger, and that Charles had concealed it, became the breaking point. For Harry, the discovery was like a match to dry tinder. He stormed into confrontation, his voice shaking with rage as he accused his father of the unthinkable. "You let her die alone." The words cut sharper than any blade, reverberating through the halls like an explosion no one could contain. Harry's anger was raw, untamed, a fire long buried that now erupted with uncontrollable force. William, by contrast, reacted not with fury, but with devastation. Where Harry shouted, William broke. The truth overwhelmed him, collapsing years of carefully built walls he had constructed around his grief. He wept, unable to contain the torrent of sorrow. His tears, a release of pain, carried since boyhood. It was the cry of a man realizing that the silence he endured all his life had been orchestrated by his own father. While Harry's fury scorched everything in its path, William's despair was quieter, but no less powerful tears that revealed the depth of betrayal. The pain of a son who adored his mother and trusted his father, only to discover that both trust and memory had been poisoned. The contrast between them could not have been starker. Harry channeled his grief into rage. Every sentence, an indictment, every breath, a demand for accountability. William, drowning in sorrow, seemed paralyzed by disbelief, unable to comprehend how the father he depended upon could choose secrecy over truth. This split between them, one son consumed by fire, the other undone by sorrow, was the emotional fracture Diana had feared for her boys. Now, standing in the shadow of her death, they were divided not by choice, but by the unbearable weight of truth. For Charles, the confrontation was a nightmare he could not contain. Two sons, standing on opposite edges of grief, united only in their anger and pain directed at him. The rift widened with every word. No fatherly justification could soothe Harry's outrage or mend William's devastation. Instead, Charles retreated into silence once more, clinging to the same instinct that had doomed him years earlier. The belief that saying nothing was safer than speaking the truth. That choice only deepened the divide, transforming family into adversaries. A house once bound by lineage, now torn apart by betrayal. Courtiers scrambled desperately to restore order. They whispered, they intervened, they tried to manage the unmanageable, but nothing could contain the storm raging within the royal family. Family unity, so carefully projected for the public eye, was crumbling in real time behind the palace walls. Arguments flared, doors slammed, trust fractured. Yet, not a trace of this chaos reached the outside world. To the public, the monarchy still appeared polished, dignified, untouchable. But in reality, it was collapsing from within, its future shaken to the core by truths buried too long. For William and Harry, the pain was personal. For the monarchy, it was existential. And though the world remained blind to this collapse, the damage was irreversible. The brothers' grief was real, raw, and permanent. Two men shaped forever by the silence that had cost them their mother's truth. Yet the brothers' pain was only a fragment of the storm because the truth Diana carried reached far beyond her deathbed. What if Diana herself had left behind not just warnings, but a confession so dangerous it could destroy the monarchy's foundation? That was the question that haunted William as he uncovered yet another piece of his mother's hidden truth. Tucked away, buried as though it were a crime to even exist, were Diana's final diary entries, pages that bled fear, desperation, and revelation. They were not the words of a woman resigned to fate, but the cries of someone who saw betrayal closing in from within her own family. These diaries were more than personal reflections. They were a record of secrets too volatile to be made public, and they revealed the extent of Diana's terror in those final days. William read passages that spoke of shadowy meetings, encounters she believed were orchestrated behind her back. She wrote of whispers in corridors, of alliances forming without her knowledge, of being cornered by forces she could neither trust nor control. Every line carried the weight of someone who knew she was in danger, not simply from the relentless press, but from powers far closer to home. These words were not the ramblings of fear. They were calculated observations from a woman who sensed the walls tightening around her. And as William read them, he felt the chill of recognition. His mother had not been imagining betrayal. She had uncovered it. The diaries exposed a woman trapped in a gilded cage, her voice dismissed, her warnings ignored. She felt utterly isolated, an outsider within the very family she had married into, cut off from the support she needed most. She wrote of being unheard, her pleas for understanding falling on deaf ears. William's heart ached as he turned each page, hearing her voice echo across time. But alongside the heartbreak came anger. Why had no one told him this existed? Why had these words been hidden from her sons, when they were her final attempt to make sense of her crumbling world? The answer was cruel but clear. Charles had feared these diaries becoming public. He understood the damage they could cause, the way they could paint him not as a grieving ex-husband, but as a man complicit in her downfall. For Charles, secrecy had always been the weapon of survival. Better to bury the evidence, to lock it away where no one could find it, than to allow Diana's voice to speak freely from the grave. And so, the diaries were entombed within the palace walls, their existence whispered of, but never acknowledged. For William, this discovery raised the most dangerous question of all. Was his mother's death truly an accident? Or had the truth been sacrificed for the survival of the monarchy? Each word Diana had written suggested that she had sensed danger long before that night in Paris. She had seen the betrayals forming around her, the indifference of those who should have protected her, the chilling silence when she begged to be heard. Now, with every revelation, William's grief twisted into suspicion. This was no longer the story of a tragic accident. It was the story of a woman silenced, of a mother erased to protect an institution. And William, now staring at his father's decisions with new eyes, wondered if the monarchy itself had demanded her sacrifice. And then, in one chilling twist, William discovers the role Camilla played in his mother's torment during those last days. In Diana's last days, Camilla wasn't absent. She was everywhere. A shadow Diana couldn't escape. For William, reading through his mother's final note and the testimonies buried deep in the archives was like stepping into her torment. The letter revealed a woman who no longer felt like a wife, nor even like a mother allowed to stand at the center of her children's lives. Instead, she felt pushed aside, her existence overshadowed by Camilla's constant presence. Even as Diana tried to carve out a space of dignity, she sensed that the man she once trusted was already living in another world, one where she was no longer welcome. Accounts William uncovered painted an even darker picture. Court records and whispered testimonies confirmed what Diana herself had feared. Charles's late-night calls with Camilla had not slowed in those final weeks. Instead, they intensified. The very hours when Diana wept alone, struggling with betrayal and isolation, Charles was speaking in hushed tones to the woman who had always stood between them. These weren't mere conversations. They were lifelines Charles clung to while Diana fell deeper into despair. For William, the words leapt from the page like daggers. His mother had been abandoned, not only by silence, but by the deliberate choice of companionship with another. Insiders close to the palace confirmed what Diana had confessed in her diaries, that her heartbreak reached unbearable levels as she watched the father of her children build a future without her. Even as she still lived, she was not just isolated from the monarchy. She was exiled from her own marriage, denied the dignity of being recognized as the woman who had given her life to the crown. Each revelation tightened the knot of anger in William's chest. It was no longer about an institution failing Diana. It was about his father choosing another woman's comfort, while the mother of his children cried out for help. That realization was unbearable. Fury consumed William, not only toward Charles, but toward Camilla herself, the woman who, in his eyes, had stolen the space his mother deserved. To him, it was no longer just betrayal, it was erasure. Camilla wasn't simply present in those final days. She was the shadow that loomed over them, the reminder that Diana's pleas for love and recognition were ignored. The heartbreak became too sharp to rationalize. William's emotions erupted. The idea that his father had chosen Camilla over Diana, even in those haunting final moments, was more than he could forgive. The pain that had been building through the hidden file, the sealed letter, the diaries of despair now reached its breaking point. For William, there was no longer any doubt. His father had made a choice, and in doing so, he had abandoned the woman who had loved him once, and the mother who had loved her sons, until her final breath. This was the moment that marked the deepest fracture between father and son. Trust, already weakened, was now shattered beyond repair. The son who once sought his father's guidance could no longer see him as anything other than the man who failed his mother when she needed him most. But it was what came after the palace cover-up that truly destroyed William's trust forever. What if the greatest royal tragedy wasn't just Diana's death, but the carefully orchestrated cover-up that followed? For William, the truth came crashing down not in one devastating blow, but in fragments of pieces of evidence that revealed how deeply the palace had conspired to bury his mother's voice. Behind the grandeur and pageantry of tradition, courtiers worked tirelessly to erase the rawest parts of Diana's final days. Her fears, her writings, her warnings were all treated not as a grieving woman's truth, but as dangerous liabilities that had to be silenced. What should have been a legacy of courage and honesty was instead stripped down, rewritten into something sterile, palatable, and safe for the monarchy. The official narrative the world was given was polished until it gleamed. Diana became a tragic figure in a car accident. Nothing more, nothing less. But that sanitized version was built on omission, carefully removing the parts that would have exposed the monarchy's fractures. The diaries, where she poured her fears, vanished. The letters where she confided her sense of being hunted, betrayed, cornered, hidden away. Even testimonies from those who had been close to her were altered, reshaped until they matched the version the crown needed to survive. The world saw grief and pageantry, William, however, now saw manipulation. Through whispered accounts and buried files, William discovered names of officials who had sworn their loyalty not to Diana, not even to truth, but to silence. They were the gatekeepers of the monarchy's reputation, men and women who had signed their allegiance in secrecy, promising to keep the darkest details from ever surfacing. Some destroyed files. Others blurred timelines, editing out the hours when Charles failed to act, when Diana begged for her sons, when choices could have changed everything. It was a machine of deception, one that did not hesitate to sacrifice memory for image. For William, the betrayal went beyond personal grief. It was theft. He felt robbed of his mother's legacy, stripped of the chance to know her final truth. Every destroyed document, every altered testimony, every blurred line in the timeline was another piece of her life stolen from him. The palace had not only taken Diana from the world, they had taken her from her sons. And this, more than anything, shattered William's belief in the monarchy he was destined to inherit. It revealed an institution that did not protect the innocent, but instead protected itself at any cost. The realization cut him deeper than anything else. His mother's courage had been erased, her warnings buried, her dignity compromised. And in their place, a pristine, lifeless story had been offered to the world. William, left to carry the truth, could no longer ignore the weight of silence. He began to understand that his mother's final words, her cries for help, had been buried not by accident, but by design. And with every revelation, his anger hardened into resolve. And so, with tears in his eyes and betrayal in his heart, William makes the decision that will shape the monarchy's future forever. After decades of silence, Prince William reaches his breaking point. The truth about Diana's final days has left him shattered, but also determined. In a private confrontation with Charles, years of suppressed pain erupt. William's voice trembles as he demands answers, his eyes filled not only with sorrow but with fury. The facade of father and son crumbles, and in that moment, William collapses under the unbearable weight of grief. Weeping openly for the mother he lost, and the truth that had been stolen from him. Yet, from that collapse, rises resolve. He vows never again will Diana's voice be silenced. Never again will her memory be twisted into something convenient for the crown. For William, the monarchy he is destined to inherit must be built not on secrecy, but on truth. And though in public he maintains the mask of calm duty, behind closed doors, the fracture burns deep. The war between loyalty and justice raging within him. The question remains, when the crown is finally his, will William choose silence, or will he tear open the past and let the world see everything that has been hidden? And as the nation watches, unaware of the storm brewing behind palace doors, the future of the crown hangs in the balance.